Right, I think I'm ready. Are you guys ready? Cool. Let's rock and roll. Hey, it's May Day. Yep, it's the 1st of May. And welcome to Level 4 Lockdown in South Africa. I hope you guys are all going as crazy as I am at the moment. In this week's episode, I chatted to Kev Sanders. He has a creative business called Disruptive Intent. He's got a podcast with the same name. So as fellow podcasters, we decided to get together and do an episode, chat about our podcast, chat about the guests that we've had, chat about the future of our podcast and the future of podcasting in South Africa. So I hope you enjoy this episode. And without wasting any more time, let's get to it. Right, so... First of all, Kev, how's it going, man? What's happening with the lockdown? How are you handling the lockdown?
No, so far so good. Like I said, actually, I'm still fortunate enough to be able to do to still have work to do that I can do from home. And then actually the lockdown has forced me to be a lot more creative, not just with the podcast side, but with videos and films that I make and photography side. Okay, I haven't touched that much, but on the design side, it's forced me to sit in front of my laptop instead of just watching Netflix, to trying to be a bit more creative.
Yeah, exactly. I know the feeling, because I suppose like the first couple of days for me was like, okay, I've got a bit more time on my hands, because I mean, you know, I've still got a day job, as I'm sure you have as well, and so like I was like, for the first 5 days, I was like, yeah, this is cool, watch a bit of Netflix, and then after a while I realized, but hang on a second, okay, this is not exactly what you should be doing with your extra time. You should be doing some more creative stuff.
Exactly. Well, like I said, now before we get started, for the people on my side that don't know you and don't know who you are, can you give an elevator pitch on who is Andrew?
I was afraid you were going to ask that, that whole elevator pitch. So, I mean, here's an interesting fact. I've never been on someone else's podcast where they've asked me the question. So, it's like out of my comfort zone. So I suppose the best way to describe it is like I'm a normal guy. I've got a normal day job. You know, when I left school, I went and I did the smart thing according to my parents. Went and studied, got myself a job, and that kind of thing. And I got sucked into the sort of like corporate environment. And I suppose I never really explored my creative side. And a couple of years ago, I got into, I've done bits and pieces along the way, but I got into 3D printing a couple of years ago as a hobby, and then that turned into like a little bit of a self-sustaining hobby, a little bit of a business on the side. And over the years, when I was in school, I used to read quite a lot, and after school, I didn't. And then when I try to get back into it, I found it very difficult. And I found that audiobooks and podcasts worked very well for me. And then a couple of years ago, 18 months ago, 2 years ago, I decided that I wanted to start my own podcast. And I had to think about, what I was going to talk about. And just in my normal sort of spare time, I go and I ride my motorcycles, I get tattoos, and I make new friends and watch local music and that kind of stuff. And it just seemed like a natural fit to be chatting those conversations that I'm having with those guys when I go out and socialize, bring that into the podcast. So now I've got the podcast, which is called the Bearded Friend Podcast. I originally started out and called it the Nerve Podcast. But I wasn't doing any extreme stuff like jumping off a building or doing any extreme stuff. So I thought, okay, maybe it's not the best title for a podcast. And someone said to me, why don't you make it a little bit more about yourself, build your brand? And so I decided to use Bearded Friend because I was using that as my Instagram handle. Yeah, and that's basically it. I mean, that's nothing special, but just a normal guy, just enjoying life and trying to connect with as many people as I can and having fun doing it.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly like so. You said you're actually cutting yourself short there by saying you're just a normal guy, because it's not that normal these days to follow your pursuit, your whatever you want to do. Because when I tell people like I said, I actually want to be a full-time, do podcasting full-time and do the photography and filmmaking in that full-time, they look at you funny. And it's like I said, can you make a living off that? And then they don't understand that it's, like I said, you actually want to just, like I said, there are people doing it for a living. And if they can do it, we can do it. And I think that's a key thing that people don't realize. So it's not a normal thing to follow your dreams. Like I said, have a podcast and do this thing and schedule the time to speak to people and that, and see the opportunity in that.
Yeah. Look, I think running a podcast is not easy. In the beginning, there's quite a steep learning curve. Fortunately, I've had quite a bit of, I wouldn't say experience, but I mean, I've played around with it quite a lot before for other purposes, editing sound and editing video. Not that I'm that great at it, but what I'm saying is I was comfortable using the tools. And I was like, okay, for the first year that I'm going to do this hobby, if I can call it hobby, I'm not going to spend too much money on it, because I do have a habit of going out and saying, I want to start a podcast. I need to have the best equipment and all that kind of thing. So I made a deal with myself because like getting into 3D printing when I did was quite expensive. And even though it worked out per se, I mean, I paid for my printers and all that kind of stuff, through the business that I was doing. It was, I didn't want to go and drop like 35,000 Rand on podcasting equipment. Exactly. And without having a sort of like a sense of whether I was going to be able to sustain it, was I going to get into it and stay in it? And what was, what were the sort of ways that one could generate money out of it, and how long would it take to do that? So I was like, okay, let me just feel it out a bit. And fortunately, in this world, you can get into these things relatively easily. There's a low barrier to entry to get into podcasting, because you can get decent sound from inexpensive equipment. So
exactly.
So that's what I did. Is I bought 2 lav mics that plug into my cell phone, and actually used 2 cell phones. And I was, going on the road, if you want to call it that, and doing podcasts, going to the people themselves and doing podcasts with them. And the sound wasn't too bad. I had a couple of instances where the sound wasn't that great. And then after a year, it was starting to get some traction. I could see that in the metrics that it was growing organically, and every month my downloads per episode were increasing. And I decided to spend some money on equipment. As you can see, I've got some Rode mics, and I bought myself a Rode podcasting desk. So I've got two mics, and I've bought myself a webcam. And I had an idea that I want to switch over into doing video, which I've now been like almost not catapulted, but like just because of the sort of lockdown, and I was basically ready to go with the video. I've decided to just start pumping out the videos, because it's a lot easier now, because we're doing a lot of these conversations online, Zoom, Skype, whatever. So it's a lot easier to manage and edit and all that kind of thing. Not that I edit that much, but look, I'm still trying to work out how one makes this a sustainable business. At least cover one's costs and all that. But and I think South Africa's a lot different to the rest of the world. The rest of the world seems to it ramps up very quickly, whereas in South Africa you find that it takes, 3 to 5 years before something like this starts getting traction. So if you're getting into podcasting, you really need to be in it because you enjoy doing it, because you're passionate about it, rather than, okay, this is a way for me to generate money in the short term. That's my view on it. And I don't see other podcasts as competition. I see other podcasts as peers, and I like to interact with a lot of other podcasts, find out what's working for them, looking at how they're doing stuff, what works for me. I don't want to copy anyone, but it's we all look at other podcasters around the world that have been successful or have online videos that explain how they started their podcast, and we all look at them and say, okay, I like the way that guy did that. okay, I'm going to incorporate something like that into my podcast. You might copy it directly. Or you might take a different variation. And yeah, so I think the thing is that every day, or every podcast episode that I put out there, I'm trying something new, looking at what the impact is, what sort of feedback do I get on it. I mean, some podcast episodes that I thought were going to do very well didn't do very well. And the ones that I least expected to do well did well. So, there's information in there that you can use. But I'm doing it because I enjoy it. I'm doing it because I have fun doing it. The whole process, like setting up the conversation, interacting with the guy up front, doing my sales pitch, having the conversation with the person, editing it afterwards, listening to it again, publishing it, and then getting feedback on it. It's really is rewarding. So yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Well, like I said, I started my podcast for the same reason, because I wanted to interact. I've always been fascinated by people's origin story and where they come from and what did they do and how did they get from, for instance, from being a normal person in society to becoming this like extremely talented person in a certain aspect, be it freestyle, motocross, be it whatever's active. Like I said, if I find it interesting, I want to interact with that person and find out what makes them tick. I always use the phrase and say, I want to find out what makes them funny and what makes them money, because then you can kind of get to know how their brain works. And it started off, like I said, it landed me the opportunity because on my third episode, I got Ken Block on the podcast, and that's just because when I reached out to Gymkhana Grid, they thought, okay, what do you have to offer from a media side? I said photography, and then I wouldn't mind doing interviews with these people. And I just checked the boxes of all the drivers that I wanted to do interviews with, and boom, just because I had the podcast, it gave me a reason to interact with one of my idols. And I think that even if it starts making money and I can sustain like the podcast cost from just podcasting, those experiences I value a lot more than anything else. And so being able to reach out to a person more than just being a fan first off, and then actually being having a reason to chat to those people, because I get 90% of the people that I reach out to, they probably get thousands of messages and emails of people wanting to interact with them and saying they're fans or whatever. But now I can reach out as a media, if I can put it in brackets, and say, hey, I would like to have you on my podcast. I have X amount of audience that I can give you exposure to, or if you like it, if you want to have that sales pitch, you can do that route and just interact with them, sit and then find out they're actually insane people. Like, for instance, I had this chat on to Jimmy Hill, and he insisted he wanted to do the podcast on FaceTime. And I said, I'm not sure if it's going to record. I'm not sure what part's going to do. And we did the whole podcast. I think we had the podcast for like 40 or 52 minutes. And afterwards, I called him back. And I said, Jimmy, we have a problem. And he said, what? I said, none of the audio recorded. There was some issue, whatever. He said, okay, cool. Tomorrow I have a few beers to start up the morning, and then we can do it again. I said, oh, you're just, like I said, he's one of the guys in Freeride FMX, and he's just, no, okay, cool. We'll do it again tomorrow. And he's finding out like, they're so like normal people, if I can put it bluntly like that. But getting to your point about podcasting and that in South Africa is, I think when I saw the opportunity kind of thing, it's like, I've always been a fan of Joe Rogan. If you know, like I said, my friends, they probably all get sick of me referring to Joe and some guests that he had on and this or that or that. But I wanted to do that. Like I said, I wanted to have casual conversations with these remarkable people and put them in a scenario where it's not a media thing where they're looking for a 10-second soundbite. They're looking to have a meaningful conversation with these people, and actually not just at the end of their life pick up a biography or autobiography of them and then read through their book. But like I said, while they're like in their prime, if I can put it like that, interact with them, find out who they are, what they are, and then get going from there.
Yeah, absolutely. But so, I mean, what's your background in terms of creativity and photography? Because I mean, that's something that I've seen that you be doing quite a lot is the photography side.
Well, okay, to give you a bit more of a background, when I also, like I said, after school, followed mom and dad's advice, went and studied and got a few diplomas in IT, started working in IT. Like I said, when I was in school, I thought that was going to be I was going to be 50, 60 years old and still be a CTO, a CIO, whatever of a company. And that's what I saw. And then I started interacting with this friend of mine, an old business partner or ex-business partner of mine. And we started a company together. We started growing this company, and then we said, okay, we need to do marketing on social media, and we need to get. But all these agencies were charging us an arm and a leg to do marketing. And then we eventually said, okay, cool. I said to him, well, let's start a company of our own and I'll do our own marketing. We won't expand to clients. We just run our own company's marketing and social media, and we play around and experiment with our own social media. And then we grow it from there. And then it got to a point where I needed to do product photography, and then it just grew from there. I said, I started finding an interest in it. I took the camera along when I went to my normal motocross days or FMX events and started taking photos. And then I started reaching out to these people. And then one thing led to another where I said, okay, cool. I actually now getting paid jobs to do from all over to do photography work. And the same with the film stuff. I was always fascinated about film. I watched the film to see how they use creative elements to do that, and then I said, okay, I wanted to create film. And then the podcast is just the expansion of that. Like I said, when I started Disruptive Intent, it was a marketing agency, and it grew a photography leg, and it grew the videography leg and the filmmaking leg, and now the podcasting is just another leg it can stand on as to sustain the whole idea of Disruptive Intent being a media house, if I can put it like that.
Yeah. So is Disruptive a full-time thing for you, or is it a part-time thing for you?
Unfortunately, not a full-time thing yet. Like I said, I still have my day job where I work for telecoms ISP in South Africa. I work in business development where I sit and develop business processes and that. But like I said, the cool thing about I've always been that guy that criticized my day job, that I hated working in corporate and I hated working this. But now I've actually come to learn that it's just another opportunity to get inside information from these companies that are doing it on a grander scale. Like I said, Disruptive Intent is a business, and I need to see it as a business, and it needs to sustain itself at some point in time. While yes, the photography side is fun, the podcasting is fun, but once it gets to a stage where you need to employ someone, there's HR that's involved. When you have to send invoices and stuff, there's a lot of financing. There's a lot of SARS once they're cut as well. And now, as a business, working in business development, I can interact with all those departments within the company and see how they do it. And then without having to pay the school fees and pay this and that to learn these things on my own, I'm inside a corporate that's already got this stuff figured out, and I can take their knowledge and then apply it to my company and use it to sustain my business in that sense.
No, that's actually a very good point, sir. I've never thought of it that way. Although, I mean, I've learned quite a lot from working in the corporate world, from finance to HR and all that kind of stuff. So I'm very fortunate in that sense that I'm very comfortable with those kind of aspects of business.
Exactly.
The one thing that I've been learning, my learning curve has been around the sort of creative thing. Okay, how do I create stuff? How do I, like for instance, on the 3D printing side, designing. I mean, I'd never done any designing before. And over the years, people have come to me and said, "Hey, listen, I've got this widget. Can you please reverse engineer it for me?" And I've learned different techniques on how to do that. And then also with the podcasting, like I said, I had done audio editing before, so I was comfortable with the tools. But it was like, okay, how do I package something? Before it was just like, okay, let's just chop out the beginning and the end and some noises and do a little bit of noise cancellation and do some enhancing on the audio to make it sound better. Now it was I want to create a podcast episode. Sure, but I need an intro. And now how do I what do I do? Do I give it a little bit of a summary about what the episode's going to be like. People going to get bored every time they listen to the podcast. They're hearing the same sort of intro. How do I mix it out? So it's like those kind of things that I'm learning at the moment. I don't know if I'm getting it right, but
Well, I think that's the cool thing about this. It's like I said, you can do it the way you want to do it. It's not like I said, if I do work for the telecoms and the ISP company that I work with, they've got a set standard to where you have to do those things. With this, you can do it if you feel you want to do it this week, you want to do it this way. Then do it this way. I had the thing where when I started, I can't remember who said it because I kept on thinking. Someone asked, look, I had Tim Willman on, and he asked me like, where did the thing come from, the introduction? Because I always say, okay, cool, give an elevator pitch on who you are. Yeah. And then when he mentioned, so, okay, let me give my elevator pitch on the podcast on the episode, and I was shocked because he actually listened to the episodes and kept catched on that I kept on saying it, and it became kind of something. And I did it without even, like I said, I just needed a way to ask the person to kind of give a little explanation about them. And now it's kind of become a thing where I just do it. And I did it, like I said, with every podcast that I do. And it's not because and I think that's the thing about, like I said, getting back to being how to do is I think you need to surround yourself with the content that you consume influences you in that way. I think that's, like I say, if I enjoyed Joe Rogan's podcast, then I listen to his podcast, and you can get kind of influenced about how he does his things and how he does it. And as soon as you start watching something else, then it influences you in that sense and scenario. Because I've just, like, even with the movies that I watch lately, I've watched a lot of rom-coms with my girlfriend, and watched on my own. Like I said, this morning I watched the Joker movie, and I was sitting there and I looked at it from a different side, because that's a whole sad part, and it's dark and gloomy, and it's a bit of sadistic, but then that influences me. And like I said, I'm busy designing a helmet for myself, and I saw how kind of this whole watching these dark and gloomy and whatever movies influenced my design in that sense. And then the exact opposite. When I was at her place the last week, we watched rom-coms and funny stuff and sitcoms and this and this and that short bit moments of how a sitcom is shot and how rom-coms are, and the quick punchlines and trying to be funny and cheesy and whatever. That also kind of influenced my writing when I wanted to write a script for new ideas that I have, because I have a little journal where I've got up any idea. I just jot down the idea, and I saw how that influences, like I said, the content that I consumed, the content that I put out, basically.
Yeah, well, that's actually interesting, because, I mean, you mentioned Joe Rogan, and I think the one thing that I've learned from Joe Rogan, I must admit, I haven't watched all of his stuff. I've watched mainly the guests that I'm interested in, like Sam Harris and the guys from Metallica and whoever it might be. But one thing I learned from Joe Rogan's is that, I mean, some of his episodes are 2 hours long. And what it made me realize is that there is a market for people that are interested in listening to long-form conversations. Whereas like in this world where you've got TikTok, Instagram, things are 10 seconds, some things are 15 seconds, and they've got these maximums of a minute or whatever. You almost get the feeling that, okay, a long-form podcast is not going to appeal to people, whereas it actually does appeal to people. So that was one thing that changed my mind a little bit about doing a podcast where there is no time limit. It just turns out that most of my conversations are between 45 minutes and an hour and a half. I mean, but I have had some conversations that have gone on for 2 hours. And in some cases I've made them into two parts. Other cases I've just left them as they are, an hour and 55 minutes, whatever it was. And others I've edited down because we might have started talking about something that I wasn't, there wasn't really like the purpose of the conversation. Like, I chatted to a guy by the name of Brent Spilkin, Spilly. He's a business coach, that kind of stuff. And I brought him on to the podcast because I wanted to talk about that. And he's got a thing which is called BROP, which is like a biker's business and breakfast that he had run last year, and he's running it again this year. Well, except for the COVID COVID-19 issue. But, I brought him onto the podcast to talk about that. But we landed up having a conversation about social media and, is Google listening to us? And we went into this like sort of tech conversation, the privacy of information and all that kind of. It was a very, very interesting conversation, but it wasn't really the theme of the podcast. So what I did is we still had our business bikers breakfast conversation, and I just made the social media conversation. I made that as bonus material for that episode. Okay. Yeah. So, and it was so funny because the bonus material got more downloads than the main episode, which is interesting because, you sometimes wonder if the subjects that you're talking about are interesting to people. And, I have put out a couple of things on Instagram asking people, okay, of my podcast theme, because I specifically said it's motorcycles, tattoos, and craft. And the thing with craft is I can put quite a lot under craft, but at least people know that there's a creative side to the conversation, whether it's local music, whether it's fashion, whether it's us talking about podcasting. There is a conversation. Another conversation I had was with a guy that did an internship with a podcast in Australia. And so, I mean, it all fits under that theme. But I put a couple of things out there and saying, hey, listen, which ones do you enjoy the most? And the thing was that of those three subjects, I got equal amounts of feedback on them. So 30 odd percent was this, the other 30% was that, and the other 30% was on the craft side. So, it was almost like validation that, like the people that were listening were enjoying the content that was coming, or at least, some of them were enjoying two of the subjects and others were enjoying all three, or whatever it might be. So I think it's and then the other thing I wanted to say in terms of podcasts, when I started listening to podcasts, because I come from a sort of like a scientific background, and I'm also into IT now. I went over from chemistry to software development. So it's like very technical and that kind of thing. So the sort of podcasts that I started listening to were very technical ones, whether it be on new technologies, whether it be mobile development or whatever. And then I happened to come across a podcast that was none of that. It was just two guys having a conversation. It just happened to be a guy that was working for Microsoft who had a technical podcast that I was listening to, who happened to mention that he had another podcast, and it was called Coffee House Blunders. And there they were just talking about coffee, about games, about technology, about movies, about chess. Because the other guy that was in the podcast was he's one of the co-owners of chess.com, and they just happened to be mates, and they just to stay in contact. They live on different sides of the continent in the US. They were just doing it just to stay in contact as friends, but then they were just putting it out as a podcast. And it was when I heard that podcast, that was when the seed was planted in my head that I could then create my own podcast, and it wouldn't have to be a technical subject, because that was in the back of my mind. I said, oh, sure, but if I do a podcast, it's got to be on something technical. It's got to be this thing that adds significant value. And I didn't put a value to just conversation between two people that have the same passion, whether it be motorcycles or whatever it might be. Yeah, and exactly. Yeah. So I mean, just to and that's where the idea, or that's where the seed was planted in terms of creating a podcast.
Yeah, that's actually, I think that's a cool thing, because the more podcasts you listen to and you consume, the more that I basically learn both sides of the world. Because, like I said, I've been heavily influenced by Joe of having just a conversation, unedited, just throw it out there. Like I put my intro on, I put a little like a read over, because like I said, recently I have a sponsor of the podcast. They like I said, whatever sales I make from the product, it's called the product's called Alpha CBD. So I put the ad in the front, I put a code in the front, I put a little jingle on. But then I listened to Gareth Cliff's podcast on Cliff Central, and they've got a kind of a structure. Okay, so he comes from the radio world, and they've got a little structure of this is your segment, this is your segment, that's your segment on the podcast. But I didn't want exactly that, because I like the freedom and how he speaks, and he doesn't censor himself, and he doesn't avoid any topics, and he doesn't have a specific guest that if he's interested in that person, he'll get that person on and chats to that person to find out a bit more about them. But I don't want that little segment thing, because, and again, to each their own. But like I said, I want, like I said, to value the conversation between two people, and I've seen it with my podcast where it's not mostly topical based, but as soon as I do an Afrikaans podcast, I get a lot less listeners, because then my audience shrinks.
Yeah, sure.
As on Buzzsprout, where I host my podcast, it gives you quite an accurate feel of where your listeners come from. Now, I think like 60% of mine is still South Africa, but then there's Australia and the US, and then in Europe and that as well. But like I said, obviously, if I'm building this audience, and like I said, I'm not following any topical guidelines or anything. I'm trying to stick to people that I find interesting, and most of those people are in action sports or other podcasting people or business-like people. So that's my topics, kind of. But those are the things the audience kind of is expecting of me. And if I throw a spanner in the works and I put Afrikaans podcast out, then actually you can physically see the downloads drop on that podcast. So now I kind of say, okay, no. Yes, even if I do find those people interesting, do I just leave them? Or that's the conundrum that I'm in now. Don't I interview them because I do want to chat to them? Or like I said, how do I handle the situation? And that's what I've not figured out yet. Because yes, my audience, and I don't want to constrict myself to, because I think it's super brave, like I said, where you specific, or not brave, but to actually to have a niche. So if someone searches on Apple's podcast for a biker podcast or tattoo podcast, they'll find yours. But mine, I don't have that niche or keywords to search about. Mine is more social commentary, if I can put it in that sense, because that's the category that I put it on Apple Music. It's social issues and social commentary and social this, because that's what I chat about. And sure. I think. But don't you think it's limiting to put your, because now you catering your guest or like choosing your guest upon those topics, instead of just having the free reign of having on whoever you want to?
So I think, yeah. So for me, it was I'm quite comfortable having subjects, set subjects for my podcast.
Yes.
I was like, if I want to have another podcast. I mean, if I want to bring another subject into it, I just create another podcast.
Makes sense, yeah.
So
that's the other thing. I was thinking of actually starting just an Afrikaans podcast and having Afrikaans guests, because like I said, I come from, my mom's Afrikaans, my dad was English, and so I have both. I can articulate myself in both. But then I started thinking, it's like, is it really the niche that I want to go? Is that the conversation that I want to have? Is it worth the admin to get a podcast like that? And now, because now I'm running two podcasts, and I have to find Afrikaans guests, that I have to kind of build a schedule around that, and I have to manage this podcast. So I'm avoiding it just because of the admin of having another podcast. So I think that's why I kind of keep this open and not having specifically topically based. Because I have this question often where like the people that I send an invite to, they ask me, what is the topic? What is it? Do they have to reverse? Do you have to? I said, no. I just want your honest opinion, honest answers. I won't ask if there's any topics that you want me to avoid. I'm open to that. I don't want to have my guest uncomfortable and kind of interrogate them on the podcast if it's like they have a dodgy past or something that happened in their past that I don't want to reference. But I think when you don't restrict it to a certain, or from my experience, when you don't restrict it, like for instance, when I spoke to Tim Moelman, he started speaking about his family life, and his interest in wedding photography was because of stuff that he experienced in his family. And like I said, I'm not doing the story justice here, but so he got into a way different subject. Instead of, like I said, he's a photographer. I wanted to chat to him about photography. So he got this whole route, and I kind of figured out where he came from, the Isle of Man, and his family and his wife, and they came back to South Africa, and how he just had to do it, and this and this and that. And yes, we got a little bit of technical about what camera he uses, what lenses he uses, and stuff like that. But that was on the download. That was like 5% of the podcast. The rest is just about him and how he became Tim Millman, the photographer, instead of like what camera do you use, what ISO settings do you use, or what this do you prefer, or that do you prefer. Getting too technical for that podcast.
Yeah. Look, I mean, I don't think there is an answer to the question about
definitely.
How do you put your podcast out there? I think in the way that the way I looked at it was I'm gonna have the Better Fan podcast for me was the conversations that I would be having with the people that I was socializing with or that I was connecting with, because you riding motorcycles, you meet all these new people.
Exactly.
Going to local music, you're meeting all these people, having these conversations, and they're generally around or linked to those subjects. And look, true. I mean, I've started a thing called Weekend Crack. I mean, you tuned in the other day. It's just two of my mates and I just talking shits on a Saturday morning for now. So I had this idea about Weekend Crack about 3-4 months ago, and I wanted to get my video set up to a point where the quality was relatively good. I mean, I can't afford to go and spend 30 grand on a decent camera, so I'm winging it now with low cost stuff. But it's the quality is good enough now for me. And I had this idea and to transform into that, or to launch that, I wanted to have my podcast studio set up. Which when we were chatting the other day, I said to you, it's almost done. It's like 90% done, but it got a little bit curtailed by this whole lockdown. So it's not 100% finished. So I haven't moved in there yet. But once that's up and running, I had wanted to launch this Weekend Crack. And the whole idea with the Weekend Crack is the kind of guys that I would have a conversation with. Let's say, for instance, Joe Fleming with Bonafide Moto, or some of the local music artists or whatever. If I do a podcast with them, sometimes it might be 2 or 3 weeks before I publish that conversation. And they might have something that they want to announce. They've got a bike ride coming up. They've got album launching. They've got some gigs coming up. So, in terms of timing, I can't offer them something that's, okay, it's going to be published tomorrow. So that gig that you're playing next week or the weekend after, people will have some forewarning about it. The episode might only come out after they've played the gig, kind of thing. So what I said, what I decided was I would create this thing called Weekend Crack, which is a live show on a Saturday morning. Where at the moment, I was actually going to make it in the afternoon at 3:00, but it's actually at 10:00 on a Saturday morning now because of the COVID thing. But so the idea would be that those guys would be able to either phone in or come into the studio and have a 10-minute or a 15-minute slot in the hour and announce whatever they want to announce. They might, it might even be they're planning a bike ride, people, applications or booking is open for that ride, and they can come and announce it, or whatever it might be. Or it could even be they've done a trip and you want them to come and give a lowdown. Maybe it's a new trip and they want to, give like sort of like a after action review on that trip or whatever it might be. So that was the idea with that thing. So that's why I say, the thing is that, now that I've got the process flow, the workflow down to a fine art, and I put that in inverted commas because one's always learning. But to spin up something new is relatively easy. I mean, I'm talking to another friend of mine who was a Buddhist monk. He was in a monastery for 10 years, and we're busy talking about putting together a meditation podcast, and that would be a totally separate podcast, and we would be specifically talking only about meditation. And it might not be an ongoing thing. It might just be a 6 or 10 episode series that we do. Yes. And then I move on to something else. So I think for me, it's more, it's about the agility and the fact that I've got the platform that I can just pivot. I can spin up something new and maybe take some of my current audience with me. And if it's not something that they're into, it doesn't matter. Some will come, others don't. I pick up some new people on the other side there. And I suppose it's what people are comfortable with. Just for me, it's like, okay, this is how I operate. I start new hobbies all the time. So starting a new podcast is not daunting for me because let's give it a crack, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. I move on. Fail fast is the right way to put it. Yeah, but I mean, I've had a look at all your guests that you've had, and I mean, there's definitely a theme there. I mean, there's some outliers, but on the motoring and the MX FMX side and all that kind of stuff, you've chatted to quite a few of those guys, as well as I see on the photography side as well. Also, the kind of photography that you enjoy doing, from what I can gather.
Yeah, I think that's the kind of the theme that I'm going with is whatever I'm interested in that moment. Like at the moment, not in a moment. I've been a FMX and MX fan my whole life, and now, like I said, that's I think that's my little cheat code that I'm using now is to chat to these people. Like I said, I've reached out to so many of these guys, and it's all a hit and miss with 90% of them. Like I said, for instance, I actually got a reply from Ken Roxon's agent. I don't know if you know Ken Roxon. He rides it's in the Supercross, and his agent replied to me and said, "Well, sorry, at this moment he's not taking interviews, but after this and this and this, when he's in his down season, he'll be able to." And I said, I was shocked. I was like, I'm a nobody in this world. I'm not a big reporter or this and this and that, but I got a reply from these people, and I think that's the cool thing, because I'm such a fan of these people and action sports. Like I reached out to another guy in the US, a guy that rides BMX, and we actually met at Ultimate X, and we kept in contact. And I've always said to him I want him on the podcast, but he's been touring and this and this. And now with lockdown, I reached out again, and he said, "No, definitely, he's not busy. He's just kept on practicing or whatever." So I think it's kind of what I'm interested in and the people that I'm interested in. There is definitely a pattern to that, but I feel too afraid to box it into just an action sports podcast, because when I feel I want to have someone like Tim Willman on, yes, he is a skater himself as well, but if I want to speak to him, I want to speak to him. If I want to interact with you and chat to you about podcasting, I don't want it to be but he doesn't fit the category, so now we have to start a whole new podcast or something like that. So I think that's on my side, that I don't want to limit myself to that, and having the ability to now getting a good subscriber base and listeners and downloads on this, and then but I want to go into this field and then start a whole new segment, a whole new podcast, and start a Facebook and social media and whatever on with a brand new podcast. So absolutely, that's why I try to keep it to whoever and whatever I'm interested at the time. That's the person that you're going to hear on Disruptive Intent. And if I see I think like podcasts like that we're having now has gotten the guys that actually have the most downloads. Like my most downloaded podcast is a guy that I did with Brady from the US. He's a normal guy that's on Instagram. I started following him because I like his brand called Go Fast and Don't Die. Yeah, I reached out to him and I said I want him on the podcast, and I chatted to him, and that's still to this day my most downloaded podcast. Not Ken Block, not Jimmy Hill, not anyone else. It's between him and the podcast I had with Joe and Monique from Bonafide. I did a podcast with them, and like I said, those are my two most downloaded podcasts. And that's not topical based. Those are not people that everyone in the world knows. That's just a straight up conversation between 3 people or 2 people, and those are the ones that are doing good. And I think that's to your point again about people wanting long form conversations. Yeah, I think it's like, I have, I don't know what other podcasts you listen to. I mean, you've spoken about Joe Rogan and all that. So
You know, some of the podcasts that I listen to, you know, the one is Sam Harris, which is I don't know if you know Sam Harris. He's a neuroscientist, but he talks about anything from meditation to drugs to politics and all that kind of stuff. And I don't listen to every episode, but I choose the episodes that I listen to because I see, okay, there's an interesting conversation. I go and I pull in and I listen to that. Another podcast that I listen to is an entrepreneurial podcast where the guy's interviewing guys that have started businesses, successful businesses and all that kind of stuff, which I find very interesting to listen to find out how guys have become successful. And then there's another podcast that I listen to, which is probably the one that I listen to the most. And they're doing a podcast. And we're doing it every day before the lockdown. And now that they're doing the lockdown, they're doing it twice a day, except for the weekend. So I'm looking at those guys and saying, okay, what are those guys doing right that's getting them the traction? And the thing is they are not talking about anything in particular. It's just a conversational podcast. It's two main guys. They've got two guys that are helping them, two producers that interact in the show as well. And it's called the Daily Talk Show, the Australian guys. And like for me, I'm like amazed. Like, how do they find the stuff to talk about twice a day? You know what I mean? It's like, so I'm like marveled by this. So
exactly.
Yeah. So you know, I don't think there is a what's it? The silver bullet for podcasts. I think it's definitely, you know, like, I mean, you can look at it two ways. Is it like, do you want to have 1 million followers? And there's just like, the people come and go, or do you want to rather have a small audience of, let's say, 1,000 people, but at least 60% of those people are listening all the time? I don't know what the answer is to that. And I mean, it's really difficult to get stats on like YouTube. You can go and check. Okay, this guy's got so many subscribers. They're getting so many views per episode. Okay, you can make a deduction there. Same thing with Instagram. Person's got 20,000 followers, but they make a post, they get 200 likes. Okay, what's the story there? Podcasting is a lot more difficult to try and work out what's going on with, what people are really interested in or that kind of thing. So I do. And that's why I don't concern myself too much with the metrics. The kind of metrics that I'm looking at is, okay, how many downloads am I getting on average per episode? Yeah. Over the duration of the podcast. And as long as that's growing, I'm happy.
Yeah, no, same, yeah. Like I said, that's the cool thing about Buzzsprout is it gives you, per episode download, it gives you, like in the last 7 days, 8 days. And what I've recently started seeing is people finding my podcast now and going and listening to old episodes and not waiting for new ones. They're going back to the third and second episode and listening to those episodes. But so getting to that building the audience. But I think that's the only two metrics that I'm always concerned about is in the last 7 days, how many downloads that I get, and then my subscriber, because Buzzsprout has a cool feature where they don't have a subscriber base because it's spread on so many platforms. It gives you a listener number. So it gives you a person of, let's say on Spotify, because my two main platforms I always focus on is Spotify and Apple Podcast. I get, like I said, all my downloads from that. I might get 1% from Google Cast and stuff like that, where someone finds my podcast there. But, but like I said, I don't know, just those are the I don't concern myself too, even with my photography side. I was always concerned about my followers and concerned about how many likes I get, how many views I get. Now it's just a thing about doing it and having fun and building that, and then slowly but surely building your audience instead of forcing it and focusing on I need to get 1,000 views on this video. I need to get a whatever to whatever amount of followers and subs on that. And I think that's the point that once you start too much obsessing about the metrics, then I think that's when you fall into that trap of creating content just to get views and likes and listens and downloads and subscribes instead of doing it because you're having fun doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's why I say, if anyone's getting into podcasting, they've got to understand that that's what it's about. It's like you're doing it because it's like almost like, like you want to wake up one day and realize that your podcast has gone viral.
Exactly.
Like you don't want to be watching the kettle boil, like
Yeah.
very, very slowly kind of thing. If you know what I mean? Like you want to wake up one morning and say, holy shit, that episode went bananas. Or, like if you check in on the metrics every now and again, and then one day you look, but hey, hang on a second, this thing has grown, dramatically. I think it's definitely a trap that people do fall into. And I think that's where people fall off the wagon a bit because they get discouraged. And I mean, I get discouraged as well. I mean, every now and again I'll be like, yes, is this really going the way I want it to go? And then and then I'll do a podcast with someone. I have an awesome conversation, and once I'm published it, I'll be like, what was I worrying about? It's all good now.
Exactly.
It's all good now. Yeah. So out of all the guests that you've done, who's your most favorite guest so far?
Sure, favorite. It's like picking a favorite child almost. But I really think, like I said, the ones that I had, because with my goal being having meaningful conversations is really was the one with Brady was one of my best podcasts. Like having a guy like I said, one of the cool podcasts that I also had was Jimmy Hill and Ken Blocker, and those guys are more in a factor of I wanted to meet them and interact with them, and that because it's like a bucket list kind of thing because I wanted to get those podcasts. But the podcast I had with Joe and Monique was such a, like I said, it felt so emotional podcast. Like I said, all of them are kind of not all of them my favorites, but the Joe and Monique one was super cool because they got into how they met and how their relationship started and how they went from that into building a business and all that. And like I said, that was for me extremely profound to find out their backstory and that stuff. And then like I said, the one with Brady, like I said, he mentioned in his Insta story, and it's like we chatted about everything and we kind of solved on how this whole life thing works. And because we got into such a deep personal, emotional conversation about relationships, about people that you surround you with. So, and the other, like I said, lately, the one with Tim Willman was amazing. So, like I said, I can't pick a favorite. It was like the most of them, some of them are average. And then the other ones are all ecstatic. I'm so excited when someone reaches out or accepts my invites and actually wants to talk and wants to chat. And I was like, I'm so like hyped up on interacting with those people. Like I said, even your, like I said, this podcast, I was looking forward to it because I'm not going into it. I want to talk about podcasting. I want to talk about it, like find out a bit more about you, how you think, and like I said, your idea of podcasting. Like I said, I've never actually found, or I said, the amount of people that I can chat to about podcasting is super limited. Yeah. It's like there's maybe 3 people in this, like I said, that I can chat about that has actually got a kind of an understanding about podcasting. So you mentioning that if you find a new topic that you just create a new podcast, it's like I said, if I go into Buzzsprout, I can click create podcast and boom, there's a new one. Yeah, it kind of makes me tick because I had this thing where I'm working with this company called BeFit. They're a nutrition company, and the owner wanted to create a podcast, and we recorded a few episodes, but it didn't go that, like I said, it didn't feel organic. It felt very forced. But it was, like I said, he found out very, very quickly that having a weekly schedule with his normal schedule is something, it's a hectic undertaking to maintain something like that. And then, like I said, he said, okay, cool, once this whole COVID thing is done and he's got to set, like I said, a bit of more of a schedule toward what he wants to do, then he'll start the podcast. But I think that's the thing about most people. Everyone wants to start a blog. Everyone wants to start a vlog, a podcast, a YouTube channel, and then they suddenly say, oh, but you kind of have to run this as a business. This is not a thing that you can do half-heartedly. Yes, it's a hobby, but it's a hobby that you have to keep on doing and being active with it. Otherwise, it's just going to fall flat on its face eventually. And you're gonna be disheartened, and then it's the way it's going to be, unfortunately. And if you don't maintain it and sustain it.
Yeah, I think you just touched on a very important point with these kind of things. Is that consistency is very important. People, especially the people that follow you consistently, there's this sort of expectation that on Friday morning at 8:00,
Yes.
a new podcast is coming out. I mean, I've got a mate of mine who's in Australia, who he's checking with me. Even though I've been publishing on a regular basis on a Friday at 8:00. He will still message me on a Thursday and say, "Hey, dude, is the new episode coming out tomorrow?" And I'll say, "Yeah, of course, man. Of course, it's coming out tomorrow." Okay,
exactly,
so I've been a bit disrupted. So I've got a bit of a confession to make. I've been a bit disrupted by the COVID-19 thing. Not in a negative way per se. I have been pushing out more episodes, but I haven't been pushing them out at the same time all the time. I've been pushing them out on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays if I've got the content. And if other than that, it's just my normal Friday podcast. So I have got into like a little bit of a disruptive sort of routine with the podcast. And it's really been around people's availability, people's willingness to chat, and also so I pivoted a little bit. I did say that on my podcast. I did say currently with the current situation, I'm going to pivot a little bit, and I'm going to start touching base with some of my friends around the world. Some of them who ride motorcycles, some of them who are into tattoos, some of them who are not, and touching base with them and checking in with them and finding out how things are going, how COVID-19 and the lockdown and all that has affected them. So I have gone a little bit off my topic, but I'm still trying to keep it as close as possible. So there's my confession. I did abuse my position just a little bit. So I am falling back into the sort of like traditional stuff. I just did a conversation with Sabrina from Royal Enfield Tours down in Cape Town. Published that last Friday, but I just I think the message is that consistency is one of the things that you have to do if you're starting a podcast, and I suppose more content is not a problem, less content is going to be a problem.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's definitely one of the things where what I've been guilty of is not sticking to any form of schedule on this podcast. So I reach out to people like now. That's a weird thing. This weekend I said, okay, cool. I'm going to start reaching out to people and start booking or confirming times. Now I have this podcast we're recording now. Tomorrow afternoon I've got another one. Wednesday, and I've got one that's in the mist. I'm just waiting for this person to get back. So now I have 4 podcasts scheduled within a week's time, which is never a bad thing. Like I said, I'm super grateful that these people are agreeing to chat and being on the podcast and that. But then sticking to having content now, putting a weekly episode out is good because that covers me for the next 4 weeks. Yes. So I'm slowly but surely trying to build a weekly schedule where, now I'm being flooded with podcasts, but keeping them, editing them, getting them sorted, giving everything right, and then releasing them on specific dates instead of having them like smash them all in 1 week, put them out and flood everyone with content and then being quiet for like next 2, 3, 4 weeks again. And then instead of having that, because that's the thing that I think the only thing that I would have to currently work on, because at the moment I'm happy with the quality of my podcast. I do want to upgrade to like a more studio setup and that, but I enjoy the way that I have the podcast now, because when I did the podcast with the Jungle Rush guys, I had my laptop, my mic, and I set the mic between me and Dallin and Scotty and Mike and them, and we just had a conversation. At some point we didn't even realize that the mic was there and the laptop was there anymore, but it was just a conversation. But I do want the whole studio set up and have a environment where when I get into that podcast studio, that's where this podcast happens, and that's where recording happens, and it's a soundproof room and it's got sound deadening and all that in it. But like I said, at the moment want to keep it as it is now and run it from there. And then, like I said, slowly but surely building the audience to a space where I can invest more of my resources in the podcast and build something like that. With me wanting Disruptive Intent to become a media house. I spoke to my girlfriend over the weekend. I said, I want a space where I can do podcast recording and audio recording at a high quality with like good quality equipment, and have a studio photography section in that same place where I can do studio product photography, whatever I need to, and then even to go as far as setting up a green screen and being able to record video and film video in that type of environment, having a place where I can rig lights on the roof and stuff like that. So build towards a setup like that and in a space like that. And said, I think the podcast, having all these legs slowly but surely building up now, where I'm using my website and Instagram for my photos, and then eventually building up to a bigger setup of having a studio. And actually, because the one podcast that I listen to is called Two Bears, One Cave. They two comedians, Tom Segura, Bert Kreischer. They each have their own podcast. But when I started researching and reading up about Tom, he's got a podcast studio in LA where he's got more than one stage setups. So let's say, for instance, their Two Bears, One Cave podcast, they've got a set that's got the mics and a table and a background, and it's lit well, and there's a seat for the producer, and then they've got another podcast called Your Mama's House, where it's him, his wife, and a guest, and whoever guest, and they've got a more loungy effect. So he's got this studio space, and every corner basically of this whole studio is set up in a different scene. So for instance, their podcast is more of a lounge effect. They're sitting on lounge chairs. They're more couch vibe, where the Two Bears, One Cave is basically a table with two comfy chairs and mics. That's it. And they've got a screen in the middle where they don't actually use it. They just put the logo of the podcast on there, and that's it. But they've got so much, and people, other podcasters come there and they basically rent an hour of their studio space to come and record their podcast in that studio space, which I think is actually a way to make a sustainable business out of it in the long run. Like I said, now, yes, it's me with my laptop and a mic and sitting here chatting with my normal headphones on. But I think having the podcast studio would be a way of, yes, yeah, cool, I can come and record my hour and a half podcast with my guest, but then also there is still, let's say, 10 hours of the day left where that podcast can start paying for itself and sustaining itself and be seeing the more businessy side of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that was my idea with my podcast studio as well, is that that I would make it available to other people to use, and I can help them. So if someone wants to start a podcast, they don't want to spend the money on the equipment. They also want someone that can guide them in terms of the production, how to package it, where to host it, etc., etc. You know, that thing would be available as well for people to do that. So I think so I don't know about you, but I've noticed there are a couple of podcast studios that have popped up recently here in Johannesburg. There's one in Melville, and I see there's another. Well, there are actually two in Melville now. Guys have set up podcast studios. Yeah. So I was actually looking at using those to record my podcast because I wanted to take my sound to the next level. Take the quality. And it just wasn't going to work for me because the kind of people that I'm having conversations with, it's not like I can book them like every Saturday at 10 o'clock.
Exactly.
I needed that flexibility. So that's why I was going to do the podcast studio. So, but now I was like, I had a thought the other day. I was like, oh, sure, but with this sort of social distancing thing, and who knows how long it's going to last. I mean, when are people going to be comfortable to come and sit in a studio on top of one another, having a face-to-face conversation? Because all of a sudden we're very happy to be having a Zoom call or a Skype call, having a conversation. Whereas before I was trying to avoid, doing podcast interviews that way. I like to do them face-to-face because I just felt that there was this sort of like, especially with people that have never done a podcast before or done an interview, and you put a microphone in front of them. all of a sudden, or they're like on a video thing like this, all of a sudden they become a little bit self-conscious. And
exactly.
having a face-to-face conversation, you can create a relaxing atmosphere and get them all comfortable, and they don't even realize that you've actually started the conversation.
Exactly.
And this has happened a couple of times with some of the conversations that I had with people that have never done something like this before. Is that I just start having a relaxed conversation with them or whatever, and I set up everything and I start recording, and we're still having a conversation. And 10 minutes into the conversation, they go, "Oh, have we started?" And I was like, "Yeah, we've been talking for 15 minutes already. Yeah, we're on the game already." So so I think that is, for me, that's a bit of the unfortunate thing about doing things via video now, is that I don't have the ability to make people feel comfortable, but I'll just hone that skill over video now.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things where I thought of expanding into is the Skype and Zoom calls, because the guests that I wanted to have on are all international, and I'm not going to wait until one day one of them arrive in South Africa and come over here and then hopefully have 5 minutes to chat to them. So I kind of embraced the whole Skype and Zoom kind of vibe, and then I kind of felt even with our podcast now, like I said, you get to a point where it doesn't feel like it's a Zoom call anymore or a Skype call anymore. It just feels like a chat between and yes, I agree with you 100%. I felt kind of the opposite, where when I'm face to face with someone, they kind of like always on edge, always on guard, always not relaxed. And some of the guys even said, I'm not going to mention any names, but they wanted to redo the podcast just because now they're comfortable chatting, and they stopped staring at the microphone and started just having a conversation, and know that it's doing its job. It'll pick up the sound. You don't have to worry about it. You're talking loud enough. If you don't, we can always up it later and post. But yeah, so I think the Skype and Zoom calls now people have become a lot more comfortable just sitting and chatting over staring into their laptops and having a chat.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. Yeah. So look, I mean, and that's why I say, this kind of thing, when you're exploring it, you can't limit yourself and say, I'm not doing that. By us being locked down, it's made me realize that doing this kind of format is not that bad. And it just, like you say, it opens you up to having conversations with people that are outside the country, or even in the country, but in Cape Town, So, I mean, like the conversation I had with Sabrina, the plan was that I was going to go down to Cape Town. I'd set up about 5 podcast interviews, and I was going to fly down to Cape Town, go visit some family, go do some bike rides, and I was going to do 5 podcast conversation recordings while I was there. And unfortunately, that was I had to put that on the back burner because I couldn't fly down to Cape Town for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And so I just said to Sabrina, come, let's just do it over Skype, and because I really want to have the conversation with you. So so I think it's a positive thing in that way. It's like I've found a way to set it up that I'm comfortable and the quality is great for my to my level. And I suppose you have to be flexible in these kind of things as well. And also, taking, like you say, taking into account your guests that you're going to have on, and how they feel about having a microphone stuck in their face versus having a video conversation like this. So, I suppose one has to be flexible in these kind of things.
Yeah, I think as soon as you, like I said, I think again with the topic side is like having those limits of only doing it in a certain set way. Like I said, I myself had to learn how to schedule it, and the one thing that I not struggled with, but just had to get used to is having the time differences. Because the one podcast I did, I think, what was it? what is that? But anyway, like I said, the time Taylor, the podcast was in the afternoon, and with the time zone difference, it was 1 a.m. here. So I had to figure out, like, I have to be awake at 1 a.m. Now it's South African time, because, like I said, for her it was 6 a.m. or 6 p.m. in the afternoon. So we had to figure out our schedules, because when we started chatting and I wanted to get her to a podcast, she was in Los Angeles, so it was an 8-hour difference. She was going to be in a morning and thing, and it'll be in the afternoon, and then she had a race that she had to fly to another district or county or whatever, the America, and then a time zone change. Then, like I said, we still had to set time, but like I said, with the time zone difference, it was a bit hectic. But luckily, like I said, I think that's the other flexibility of having it. I think that's the other thing, that when I extend my invite to these people, I say to them, we can schedule it at a time, whatever that's comfortable for them, with the whole Skype thing. So if they feel after a hectic day of training and doing this and this and that, they've got a half an hour after the day when they get home, they can quickly sit around the laptop and we can have a chat where it's not a formal thing, it's a casual chat between two people having a conversation and chatting about whatever comes up on that side. And it's that I tell them up front, I'm not going to edit out. Obviously, if they come to me and say, yes, can you please edit, like I said, my sponsors won't be happy if I say fuck on the podcast, I'll edit it out for them. But I'm not too much into editing, because as soon as I feel like you lose authenticity when you start editing conversations out. Like I said, it's super cool what you did and made bonus content with that, because you still edit that content and split it up into having, instead of having a 3-hour podcast, having 2 1.5-hour podcasts. But I think that's the the gist of it on this side.
Look, I agree with you on the editing thing. I've tried to not edit content out. I have been asked once to edit a section out because there was a bit of a conflict. And I was happy to do that. I don't have an issue with that. But like you say, is that you don't want it to sound like it's been overproduced. Is probably the right way to put it.
Exactly.
You want it to be as if you just happen to be a fly on the wall of a conversation of two people talking about the same, some sort of passion that they have. Yeah. So, I mean, have you, with the conversations you had with the guys that, let's say, for instance, the photographers, have you learnt anything from those guys? I mean, other than the podcast conversation that you had, I mean, were you swapping stories or tips and tricks and that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, in a sense, like I said, that's a key part of what I try to focus on is yes, you can go onto the internet and I can text Tim Mulman or Marku or Jono or any of those photographers that I've had on, and Jimmy, Larry Page that I had on, and I can go and ask them, hey, what settings do you shoot at? And they can tell me exactly what gear and whatever they shoot with. But what I try to focus on was figure out how they see the world. In that, if I can put it that like, so with photography, it's a very personal thing. On every person has a certain way how they film. Like I said, for instance, if now I've been obsessed with filmmakers the last time. If you watch a Martin Scorsese film, it's going to be gory and it's going to be blood in it. If you might watch Michael Bay film, it's going to be Transformers and moving and high flying actions and cars and shit going everywhere. So everyone has got their way how they see the world, and I think that's what I try to get from these people is. Like I said, when I got into Tim about why he likes wedding photography, because I said to him, as a photographer, I don't want to shoot weddings. I hate the concept. I don't want to deal with bridezilla. Like I said, I don't want to involve myself in that aspect. But he sees the family and the love and the connection and that little aunt that has the funny laugh, and he becomes immersed into that environment, and then he tries to capture the emotion in that sense. And then you get a guy like Larry Page, that's a super. Not Larry Page.
Larry Chen.
Larry Chen. There we go. Sorry, I'm keeping Google. I read an article about Larry Page on Google just now before we started the podcast. But Larry Chen, he wants to show through his photography how when he sees a car, he wants to, that feeling he gets, he wants to kind of share that in his photography, and then he tries to capture it from that sense, and he tries to share that. And I think that's way more valuable than finding out what gear he shoots with and what preferred lenses he prefers and whatever on that sense. So I think that's the essence that I want to try and get out of. What is their motivation basically behind doing it? And I'm still waiting for the podcast. Well, I think I might have had one prior that where you kind of speak to someone, you can see that the motivation behind doing what they're doing is not true. When you can kind of, like I said, oh, I called you bullshit on this, and then I think that's and I'm kind of afraid of having those podcasts, because the guys that I look up to, I don't want to find out. Let's say I meet this insane. Let's say I interview Ken Roxon, and I find out he's a super douchebag, and his motivation for riding bike is solely to make money. And I'm not saying that he is, but imagine I find that out, how disappointing that's going to be, and how is that going to affect my motion going forward and editing that podcast and that view on him. But like I said, luckily I haven't found anyone yet that I can say, okay, I called the bullshit on this person is not doing it for the right reasons. But I think that's all up to guest selection and kind of knowing the person through his social media beforehand, and then having not preempt questions, because I hate like planning what questions I'm going to ask preemptly. But I think if you kind of follow the person and have been a fan and have interacted with this person and commented on their stuff and kind of followed their lifestyle, you kind of can call the bull beforehand, and not find that out on a podcast. We sit now with a person and find out, oh, this person's got nothing to say, and he's probably got some amazing media manager managing his social media for him.
Yeah. No, fair enough. Yeah, I must admit, I mean, I suppose I do choose the people that I have on the podcast because I'm interested. I'm interested to know about them. So I hope that the people that are listening are also interested in them. And like you say, I mean, I suppose you wouldn't want to have someone on your podcast that you don't feel it with. You know, in other words, you don't connect with them. Because, I mean, I suppose that kind of thing does come across in a conversation, that if you connect with someone, you know, the conversation, and like you say, you don't have to have a long list of questions to ask them. Because if you guys are talking about something that you're passionate about, that the conversation just flows on its own.
Exactly.
And like you say, I mean, if you're connecting with that person and everything is real about it, it's going to come across in the tone of the conversation. Whereas if you're having an and this is why I don't like to look at my podcast conversations as interviews, because it's not an interview. It's two people having a conversation, and it's like, you know, like if you meet someone in the bar, right? And I mean, this has happened to me a couple of times. Like you meet someone at the bar and they're like, you know, there's something about them that you don't like. You know, your shit detector goes off, right?
Exactly.
And you don't end up having a conversation with them. You have like a 2-minute interaction with them while you're buying a drink at the bar, and you think, oh, okay, that was interesting. And then sometimes I'll meet someone at the bar and I'll start having a conversation with them, and I'll lose 2 hours of the evening because there I was having a conversation with this person, never met them before, and we happened to start talking about whatever, motorcycles or whatever it is, and you lose 2 hours. Yeah. And, you know, that's the kind of conversation that I want to have. Probably one of my most enjoyable podcast episodes to record was a musician who came around to my house. And he was like, oh, you know, I've started doing more of these things, and the guys are asking me the same questions the whole time. It's getting a bit tiring, right? So I said to him, well, this is your podcast. You can talk about anything you want. Yeah. And we just sat in my lounge, had a beer, and we just started talking about music. And we spoke about like where he came from and the music and how he writes songs and all that kind of stuff. And it was a genuine conversation. There were no questions that were pre-prepared. And that was probably my most enjoyable one because, look, I mean, I suppose I feel a bit nervous when I'm having a conversation with someone, especially someone that I don't know. Yeah. What is their expectation of me?
Mm.
You know, so it's like a two-way street.
Yeah.
But like if it's someone that you know, that you already know, let's say like Joe Fleming as an example. I mean, you know, like when when I sat down with him and Al and we were talking about, we did a trip down to Swaziland. And while we were on the Swazi trip, I did a podcast conversation with him. I mean, I know the guys. You know, we're having a conversation. I'm just saying, hey, guys, I mean, geez, you've done 15 of these things. You know, like, how do you do it? I mean, I've been on this trip. I've been on other organized trips before, but this one is so relaxed and everything just moves smoothly. You know, like, how do you do it? You know, we're having a conversation. There's no like, I didn't feel nervous and they didn't feel nervous and whatever. But I mean, there are sometimes those conversations you have with people you don't even know.
Exactly.
That's sometimes you've got to break the ice a little bit. But what I'm saying is my most enjoyable conversation was with a guy that came around to my spot. We broke the ice by him saying, listen, you know, he's tired of these normal questions. And I mean, that just quantified my whole approach to doing a podcast conversation, is that it's not an interview. We're going to chat about things that we both enjoy. And let's have that conversation. Yeah. So anyway, I'm starting to ramble.
Yeah, I think that's the tendency. I think that's a good quality and to have, because like I said, having said myself, I can talk for hours. Like that's the thing. You can ramble these on and go on a tangent and whatever. And sometimes it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think that's when you're suited for this. When you can talk about anything. And so interesting. Okay, now it's a question that just came to mind is, how do you, like I said, it sounds weird. How do you do kind of not research on the person, but how do you stay, like I said, not relevant, but basically relevant to things that are happening, like to be able to conform to have those normal conversations. Because like, what are the content that you're consuming that helps you with these conversations in that sense?
So I suppose in a way, one would start with the low hanging fruit. You know, guys that you like. I started with the first episode that I did was with a guy that I connected with back in 2011. He's in Montreal, and he's got a riding club called Awesome Players, and they've got a YouTube channel. And I had started watching their YouTube channel a couple of years ago, and I'd interacted with him on email before, because I went to Canada on business, and I'd asked him a couple of questions about where I could buy motorcycle stuff while I was in Canada. And I mean, we had a conversation. We spoke about tires, we spoke about accessories and that kind of stuff. And so when I decided to launch the podcast, I thought that my first guest conversation would be with this guy. And it probably was the best one to start with, because I didn't even have to ask him any questions. Because once he got going, it was like a steam train. He just never stopped.
Exactly.
So you know, how much prep do I do? I've had a couple of conversations where I've gone there unprepared, right? Let's say I had a couple of good ones where I had some questions in my head, but nothing concrete. But I had stuff to keep the conversation going. And I did a couple of conversations, and I didn't even have to use those questions.
Exactly.
Because the kind of stuff that I wanted to ask them came up in conversation anyway, without me even asking. They told me the story before I even asked them. So those went well. And then I had one where I had a conversation with someone, and the moment we were having a nice relaxed conversation while we were setting up, and once I pushed record, it felt like an interview. And then when we stopped recording, then we went back to having the relaxed conversation. And I got caught off guard because I didn't have the questions to ask the guy to get the conversation going. So I learned a lesson there. So what I do now is I do have some 5 sort of general questions that I generally have, and they're not standard questions. They're questions specifically for that person. I try not to do too much research on someone beforehand, because I don't want to ask the same questions and go down the same same road as other people have gone. like I try in my mind, I try and work out, okay, what is it that I want to get? What do I want to get out of the podcast for them?
Exactly.
For them.
Yes,
So I will
yes,
say
yes.
to them, because like you say, when you invite someone to your podcast, they'll say, what is it that you want to talk about? And I'd be like, well, I'll tell you what, it's your podcast episode. You talk about what you want to talk about. Okay, you've got a business, you're doing motorcycle tours, or whatever it is, you're a tattoo artist. What is it that you want people to know about you that are going to bring them to your product? Whether it's your motorcycle tours, whether it's your tattoo parlor, whatever, or come and watch your latest music show. What is it that you want people to know about you that perhaps maybe no one's ever asked you the question? Because you know what I found is that, like someone goes for an interview on radio or whatever, they've got a 15-minute slot. They've got 5 or 10 questions they're going to ask that person. And the conversation is limited to those questions that those guys are going to ask them. Okay.
Yeah.
So there might be a story that the guy never gets to tell, guy or gal, never gets to tell because they never asked the question. So how do I create a platform? How do I create a moment for them to talk about something that they might never have gotten to speak about because they've never been asked? Yeah. So it's that kind of thing, And I don't, like for me, there's not a formula. I almost like feel it as I go. It's almost like I go with my gut kind of thing. So a lot of the people that I would have on the podcast I follow on social media, and I will see bits and pieces come up there and whatever, and it's the kind of stuff that you can like connect those dots and have the conversation and lead the conversation. Yeah. But I do have some questions just in case I get that moment where there's like a lull in the conversation. I can throw something in there and get the ball rolling again. And exactly. And then also just say to them, look, it's their podcast. They must tell me what they want to talk about.
Yeah, so, perfect. That's one of my, like I said, as a podcaster, one of my favorite moments is as soon as you can see the surprise on a person's face when they have, like when you've asked them a question they've never and they tell a story they've never told before. Same with, like I said, with all that. Like I said, even like I said, when I walked out of that media room after doing my podcast with Ken Block, and I thought that was my first. And when he said, "That's an interesting question," or interesting, and I was like, and I'm sitting there, it's like, okay, wait, contain yourself, just calm down, because like he's been in thousands of interviews, and now he's saying to me that's on episode number 3 of my podcast that's an interesting question. And I think that's the cool part, is not to try and conform to the normal media norms and normal questions of where you were born and those stupid things. Like I said, that's why I've always gotten to the point where I tell the person that I'm interviewing or on the podcast that to tell their story, to explain how they see themselves. Because one of the questions, like I said, I asked Ken was, if people call him this and that, and people have 50 different explanations of what he is and what he is to them. And I asked him, what does he see himself as? The awesome answer that I got the other day from what's this guy's name? I saw him on Instagram. He rides in the Formula Drift season, and I started checking his page out. Vaughan something Junior. But in his description, in his bio, he just says, he doesn't say professional drifter, whatever. He says just professional fun haver. And I thought that's such a cool, because everyone calls him, okay, now he's a D1 drift champion or this and this and that, but he sees himself as a professional fun haver. And I think he has a hell of a story around that. And then instead of asking about drifting or whatever, ask him about what he calls himself, instead of already having these preamp assumptions of people and then asking them kind of structured questions to prove your point and to have your questions answered, and less, like I said, and you doing it perfectly about having those people tell their stories instead of you interpreting what their story is and asking them questions to get that story out of them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, awesome. Very interesting. Yeah. Anyway, dude, listen, I'm gonna have to call it. I've got kids that I need to attend to. The joys of being a parent. Anyway,
So,
listen.
well, to end it off, then I would like from my podcast, if you can give, let's say, one small quote that, like I said, you would have kind of on your headstone of advice that you would give people, and not just about podcasting, but just in how you conduct your life, like a rule to live by the bearded Fen.
Oh, now you're putting me on the spot, because I've got a couple. I just got to choose the best one. Huh? So, I suppose, jeez. I suppose there's one that always comes to the front, and that's to live, to love, to learn, to leave a legacy.
Perfect, man.
And,
I think that's, like I said, I saw that on your headstone. I think that'll be perfect.
That actually comes from a guy, Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Probably one of the first motivational business books I ever read. And it's resonated with me all these years. And I often read other business books, and I just see the same kind of things that Stephen Covey was talking about that other people have not copied, but just continue to reinforce.
Evolve in that.
Yeah. So I think just a final point on the leaving the legacy thing, and this is one more thing I've viewed when it comes to social media and creating content, and it doesn't have to be professional content, is that by me recording podcasts and posting stuff on YouTube and everything, is that I'm leaving a legacy for my kids, for my grandkids, for them to be able to consume in many years to come. I mean, the proverbial black and white photograph that my grandparents pulled out of my great-grandfather or my great-great-grandfather, and to say, look here, he was a farmer or whatever he was. That legacy that you would see in that photograph is now transformed into something like audiovisual content that we're creating now.
Yeah.
So, and that's another thing about the podcast, is about, why do you do it, and being passionate about it and enjoying what I'm doing, is that the realization is that I'm creating content that might only probably could be consumed by my grandkids. And if that's the only thing that I achieve out of that, I'm okay with it.
That's perfect. That's the little ribbon on the present for this podcast, man. But thanks to your time, and like I said, now hour and a half into the podcast, having an awesome chat about like a fellow podcaster. Like I said, I wish you the best, and hopefully, like I said, one day we can all go and visit our like I said, each other's podcast studio and have a recap on this in a podcast studio.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Kev. It's been great.
Awesome.
Man. Cool. Well, there you have it. One podcaster to another. Go check out Kev's podcast, the Disruptive Intent podcast. It's available on Apple and Spotify. He's had some really great guests, so I recommend going to have a listen to that. Don't forget to rate my podcast on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe on Spotify, and send me some feedback via Facebook or Instagram. And that, my friends, is the end. I'll catch you next time. Well, there you have it. One podcaster to another. Go check Kev's podcast out, Disruptive Intent, available on Apple Podcast and Spotify. And don't forget to go and rate my podcast on Apple Podcast, subscribe on Spotify, and send me a message via Instagram or Facebook. And that, my friends, is the end. I'll catch you next time.